Emmanuel Macron crushed Marine Le Pen in the second round of presidential elections with 66% of the vote. Now, while he's admired by many of his counterparts across the globe as being France's golden boy leader, on home soil his popularity is, though, slipping. Our perspective guest today is Sophie Pedder, the Paris correspondent and bureau chief for The Economist. She's tracked Macron's rise to power and assessed his first year in office in her new book, Révolution Française and the Quest to Reinvent a Nation. Sophie, thank you for being with us here on France 24 and for being our perspective guest this morning. Now, we're just over 12 months into Macron's first year at the Élysée. Let's pretend that we're his teachers and he is our pupils. What scores would we give him at the end of this year? Where's he doing well and what does he need to improve?
Well, I'm not going to give scores, numeric scores, but I think that, the first thing to say is that France has returned on the international scene in a way that is really quite striking. For a number of years previously, France had been very much in retreat in Europe, but also, in further afield. Now you have a leader who is present at all the international meetings, whether or not there's progress made, whether it's G7 meetings, whether it's the European Union, France's voice is heard again, and that's really quite striking. So there's the international dimension. And then I think in terms of reform at home, it's been a long time that people have looked at France and thought this is a country that can't reform itself, that, every time there's a policy that's controversial, that people go onto the streets and the government backs down. But now you've seen a series of reforms put in place. So, obviously things aren't perfect. There are things that haven't been done, there are complications. But I think on the whole, there's a sense that the country's moving again, and that's quite new.
But, of course, compared to his predecessor, François Hollande, after his first 12 months in office, Macron's approval ratings are pretty much OK, but they are still tumbling. Just why is it that Macron's approval ratings are falling?
Well, I think there's a number of factors. It's inevitable after a first year that no leader is going to retain that kind of level of popularity. There's the fact that some of the policies he's bringing in are difficult, painful, not necessarily popular policies to bring about, and that's certainly going to be the case when he comes to cutting public spending, which is something which is upcoming, or reform of pensions. So difficult reforms are unpopular by definition. And then there are questions of style. I think that the French have mixed feelings about the sort of Jupiterian style of his presidency. So there are things that people find irritating about the way he governs France. And I think all those things is a combination that he's inevitably going to lose popularity, and particularly on the left, which considers him in terms of sort of tax policy more of a sort of centre-right president.
Now, you've used the word revolution in your book title, but of course the famous saying goes that revolutions devour their children. Could Macron be just a one-mandate president?
Anything's possible at this stage. He's just been in power for a year. There are 4 more years before the next French presidential election. Everyone remembers that the first round, as you said, was against Marine Le Pen. Those voters haven't gone away, and the risk of populism is something that is not just present in France. It's obviously present across Europe. We've seen it at elections in Italy. We've seen it with Brexit in the UK. So, there are real risks that if he can't deliver in terms of better growth, more jobs, that, those sort of nationalist, populist forces will come back. So the risk is there, and that's what makes it such a high-stakes moment for France, really. Revolutions,
of course, tend to be leftist. He has set out his stall as being a centrist, but many accusing him of being a man that's drifting more and more to the right. What would you say about that?
I think that there's definitely a perception out there that he's a president of the rich, and that's a tag that's been sort of labelled. I think it's complicated because, he does come from very much a social democratic tradition. He's very close to Michel Rocard, who was a former socialist prime minister in France, who was sort of moderate centre-left, sort of a bit Tony Blairish, that sort of moderate form of centre-left social democracy. And I think that's where Macron is. He does believe in keeping taxes down and keeping public spending under control.
But is that just a campaign promise or a campaign's gimmick to try and attract more voters? Can any politician really be all things to all men in the middle of the spectrum?
Yeah, I'm not sure that he is all things to all men. I mean, I think it's very clear that he is, his pro-European policy, his is absolutely sort of anathema to the extremes in France, both on the far left and the far right. He's certainly not trying to appeal to them. There is sort of, his support for multilateralism, for Europe, for the liberal world order, for open trade. All of these things make him very much, the sort of the anti-national front or the anti-far left candidate. So I don't think he is trying to be all things to all man, but I do think there is a sort of misperception perhaps about some of his anti-poverty policies, like cutting class sizes in disadvantaged areas, which aren't seen as anti-poverty policy because, they're not sort of traditional form of left-wing politics, but they are part of that programme. So I think that's a bit more balanced than some people see.
In your book, you have an interview with Macron at the very end of your writing. You've met him several times in the past. Let's talk about Macron as a man and Macron as a personality. Many have said that he's trying to be a French Barack Obama. Would you agree with that?
I think there are similarities, but all these comparisons are difficult to make. I mean, he's clearly got a lot of in a one-on-one situation, and when he meets people, when he meets crowds, he has a sort of natural empathy, and everyone notices this. So he does like that sort of interaction. He's very much somebody who gives people the full attention when he's talking to them and gives them the impression that they matter. And that is like a Barack Obama or even a Tony Blair in his day. So there is that sort of element. I think he's very different from someone like Barack Obama in other respects. He is incredibly, I think, sort of focused on, the policy detail, the policy follow-through, and he's decisive about making decisions and moving forward, not sort of hesitant. So in that respect, I think, if you look at some of the policy decisions he's made, whether it's taking part in airstrikes in Syria or whether it's in terms of going ahead and sticking to his reform of the SNCF, there is very much a sort of determination in his policy making, which makes him, I think, a much more decisive character than Obama.
I want to remind our viewers of an incident just a couple of weeks ago when Macron scolded a schoolboy for calling him Manu, rather in a familiar way. What did that incident reveal to you about Macron as a leader? For me, it really smacked of him being quite autocratic.
I think that he has a concept of the presidency, which he's very sort of thought through. Before he arrived in office, he had talked about this, written about this. He had this Jupiterian idea, the idea that the presidency has to be the president is a figure of respect and should be sort of not just embodying the nation, but should be embodying authority in France. That's the way he considers it. At the same time, I think it's fair to say that Macron has a sort of habit of these sort of improvised encounters which go wrong for him, and sometimes the wrong words are used. I mean, he called people lazy in the past, and he does seem to be accident prone in these sorts of encounters, which can be complicated. But I suspect he doesn't have any regrets about that particular one, because I think he was trying to make sure that the office of the presidency is a respected office.
OK, Sophie Pedder, that's all we have time for. The Paris correspondent and bureau chief here in the French capital for The Economist. A quick reminder that your book is titled Révolution Française and the Quest to Reinvent a Nation. We were hoping to bring that picture up here. There we go. Your book there on screen. Thank you very much for being with us here on France 24.